If you're staying here with me, I'll be talking about getting students talking by asking the right questions. And since it's 11:31, I'm going to go ahead and get started. One of the things, sorry, have to get back to my screen. Okay, so one of the things that we've actually heard kind of from both Angela and Nikki this morning is about interacting and engaging with our students and thinking about interaction and engagement on different levels and different ways that we can do that. This is really super, super crucial for English language learners. So it's not really possible for students to learn English by sitting back in the classroom and never interacting and never engaging. Sorry, I need to interrupt myself. I see a couple comments in the chat. Blair, if you're looking for the other session, Steve, could you drop the link in there again? People who just entered don't have access to the previous chat. So Blair, the link is in the chat for you to move to the other session if you need to. All right, so interaction and engagement is crucial for English language learners. They need to practice speaking, and they need to practice speaking, and then they need to practice speaking. But in addition, our English language learners need to practice listening. So they need to make sure that what is being said can be understood. And so in the classroom, we provide them with a space that is a safe space for interaction and engagement. So they need to practice those real interactions in our safe space of our classroom before they go out there in the big bad world and then realize they don't know what they need to say. But what happens in a classroom is that sometimes students sit back and they don't engage. And what I want us to be thinking about today is how can we engage them and how can we encourage interaction in our classes? Well, my answer to that is it's really crucial that we ask the right questions. So, sorry, that is totally wrong at the top. The two most common questions I get asked about interaction and engagement, I do not know why that says classroom management, I'm so sorry, is what do I do about students who won't talk? And what do I do about students who talk too much, right? We all have had that student, if we've been in a classroom very long, who answers every question and will not stop talking. And we've probably also had that student who won't answer any questions unless we call on them directly, and even then they still might not answer. So today we're going to deal with the first one. In our Q&A at the end of the day, if you want to talk about the second one, I have some ideas for that. But for this session, we're talking about getting students who won't talk. How do we ask the right questions to get students talking? My claim is that the art of building interaction is intimately tied to the kinds of questions that you ask in class. So today I'm going to give you 5 tips for building interaction that are related to the way we ask questions for the most part. Okay, so in order to start this, we have to think about what it takes for us to answer questions. So grab a piece of paper and a pen. It can be anything. I'm not going to ask you to show it. I just need you to have something to write on and something to write with. And I'm going to ask you to number down the page 1 to 5. And then I'm going to give you 5 questions and I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer them. And I want to see how far you get in those 5 questions in 30 seconds. Sorry, I'm trying to find my timer so I can give you 30 seconds. There we go. Okay, so are we ready? Does everybody have a piece of paper? Okay. So just write down the answers. Number 1, do you like pizza? Number 2, you don't like tacos, do you? Number 3, what's your favorite food? Number 4, where's the best place to eat that food? And number 5, how do you make that food? Okay, my timer's going off. Stop. How many questions did you answer? Tell me in the chat. Did you answer 1 question, 2 questions, 3 questions, 4 questions, 5 questions? Okay, some 4s and some 5s, all of them. As pretty fluent English speakers, this probably wasn't that difficult for us to answer in 30 seconds, right? So sometimes as teachers, we think, how long should it take me to do these activities? And we gauge that based on what we can do. And we forget that it takes our students a lot longer to do those things. I agree that number 4 is a hard one. Where's the best place to eat that food, right? But number 5, depending on how complicated that food is, that might have also been a difficult one. So 4 and 5 were kind of hard, but probably we could still answer those pretty easily. So now I want you to try this again. So number 1 through 5 on your paper. But there's a trick. This time, we're going to answer these questions in our second language. Okay? So, what if you don't have a second language? Well, if you don't speak a language other than English, just watch and listen. Okay? But consider in the future taking some language classes because it will help you empathize more with your students and understand what they're going through in your classes. If you've attended any of the DFW recent text trainings, we have a segment where our trainer Olga, who is a native speaker of Russian, teaches Russian for about 10 minutes. And it really helps participants see what it's like to be a student in a classroom. So, you know, just consider that because it will really give you a feel for what your students experience in your classroom. So have you numbered 1 to 5? Are you ready to think in your second language? Hang on, let me get my, okay. Now, I'm making it easy for you. It's going to be exactly the same questions, but you have to answer in your second language. Ready? Go. I'll repeat them for you. Do you like pizza? You don't like tacos, do you? What's your favorite food? Where's the best place to eat that food? And how do you make that food? Okay, time's up. Stop. This time, how many questions did you answer? Did you answer more questions, fewer questions, or the same number of questions? So I'm seeing a couple people who said, I still got 5 questions. I still got all the questions. Lori and Jennifer, how fluent are you in your second language?
Pretty fluent.
Okay. So if you're an advanced learner, you probably were still able to answer these at least to some degree, but fewer with less words, all of them but briefly, right? All, but you still didn't get the 5th one very well. Okay, I gave you an advance notice. You were going to have to think in your second language. So you were at an advantage this time. If you had to answer these same questions in English again, you would have been just like that. You would have been sitting and waiting for me to finish the 30 seconds. But even though you knew the questions, for many of you, you still had to think about what the answer was in your second language, right? So, right, Nikki, you already had the answers in mind, so they were there. So you were ready to answer those questions. Now all you had to do was translate them into your second language, right? So maybe it was easier. What struggles did you have? How about, so those first couple questions you could really answer, I think the first 3 questions you could answer with 1 word, right? What was hard about the last 2 questions? Martha says she reverted back to English on number 5. Martha, why did you revert back to English? Somebody tell me. You can unmute and talk, or you can put it in the chat.
We needed verbs. We needed verbs.
Okay. Angela said, and I think this is probably an answer that many will have, I didn't have the language to answer. Martha says she switched back to English absentmindedly. She just automatically switched back. Okay. Okay. Connie says I had to change my food choice to a word that I knew in my second language. And 5 was a longer process, right? That's a hard one. That's describing things in a second language that we might not always have to do in a second language. Okay, so imagine, I'm not going to make you answer these. Imagine these other questions. When do you make that food? What ingredients are in it? What other foods have those ingredients? What questions do you have about that food? What do you want others to know about that food? What do you think about eating that? All of these questions, could you answer any of these questions in your second language? I think many of us would struggle with that. And sorry, checking out the chat, Nikki, I agree. You struggle with number 2 because of the grammar of tag questions. And we're going to talk about tag questions today. And think about why they're problematic for language learners, okay? But what I want you to realize is that, wow, answering these questions in your second language, it's not as easy as it is in our first language. But questions are so important in an ESL classroom. They're necessary for interaction with the instructor. We've got to get our students talking. But sometimes they're hard to get right. And I don't mean the answer is hard for students to get right. I mean, the question is hard for teachers to get right. So let's take a look at why. So in order to do that, I want to look at 3 kinds of questions. So the first kind of question is a yes/no question. That means you answer it with a yes or a no. That's all you need. The first, at least the first question, if not the second question, well, let's forget about the second. The first question was a yes/no question. Do you like pizza, right? That's all you needed to answer, yes or no. That's a quick one, right? But then we have WH questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how, those question words we all learned in school. So who likes pizza is a WH question. And then we have those tag questions that, that Nikki commented on. You like pizza, don't you? Okay, so we have these 3 types of questions, and let me just check out the chat. Oh, okay, Lori points out something really good. It depends on personality. Can you go with the flow? Or do you get caught up on one question and have to get that question done and answered before you move on? Linda says that the first place where she took literacy training required teacher trainees to learn to read words in either Russian, Greek, or Hebrew. It was humbling and eye-opening. I can imagine, because that means you had to learn a new alphabet, right? You couldn't just use the orthography that we're familiar with in English. And it's difficult, but that is what our students struggle with so often when they're learning English. Okay, so when we think about these questions, I'm going to talk first about yes/no questions. So when I ask a yes/no question in class, in my imagination, here's what I'm thinking of. I say, do you like Mexican food? And I think that my students are going to say something like, oh, yes, I especially like tacos and enchiladas. Or maybe they'd say, no, I really prefer Italian food. How about you? But guys, my imagination is not the reality of a classroom. So in a classroom, I say, do you like Mexican food? And my students say, yes, right? So I've asked a yes/no question and they're answering it. It's only with yes or no, but I really want them to talk more than that. So the problem is that if all we do is ask yes/no questions in our class, we're not really building interaction for our students, because all they have to say is yes or no, okay? Also, yes/no questions don't even necessarily demonstrate understanding. If a student knows that you're asking a yes/no question, they have a 50-50% chance of getting it right, even if they have no idea what your question meant, right? So they don't require students to understand, and they don't really build interaction in the way that we as teachers want to build interaction in our classroom. So what do we do about that? How do we fix yes, no questions so that they're building interaction in our classroom? So I introduce you to the art of what I call the follow-up question. Okay, so when I say in class, do you like Mexican food? And a student says yes, I don't just move on to the next student. I want more information. So I follow up with a different question that now students have to tell me more, right? So I say, oh, you do? What's your favorite Mexican dish? And now they have to at least give me something more. Thinking about differentiation that Nikki talked about in our last session, if I have a beginner student, I might just ask that question. What's your favorite Mexican dish? If they can get me one word more than yes or no, I'm okay with that. But for more advanced students, I want to push them further. So I might say, well, what do you like about it? Or tell me about your favorite Mexican restaurant. So I follow up with another question, and I can individualize that based on what I know about my students and how much language they might have to answer that question. Okay. So my first tip to you is, if you're asking yes, no questions, follow up those questions or those yes, no answers with a content seeking question, and teach your students to do the same by modeling that, so that when they're talking with each other, if their partner just says yes or no, they also know, oh, I'm going to ask another question to get them to talk more. So let's try it. Okay, so let's pretend that your students come into class on Monday and you ask them, hey, did you have fun this weekend? And the students say yes. But really, if we say, hey, did you have fun this weekend? We want to know about their weekend, right? So in the chat, tell us a follow-up question that you could ask if a student says yes when you say, did you have fun this weekend? I'll give you a second to type. Perfect, Michelle. What did you do? Or Angela, what is something, sorry, my screen moved. What is something fun you did this weekend? What did you do? Where did you go? What did you do that was fun? So again, follow up. Don't let them get away with that one word, yes or no, right? Follow up. Ask them another question. What if they say no? Oh, Erin, tell me about your favorite thing from the weekend. What was the best and worst thing that happened? All of those are great answers. And now let's change it. What if you say, did you have fun this weekend? And your students say no. What kind of follow-up question could you ask? Tell me in the chat. Why wasn't it fun? Great. What was the problem? Any others? Why not? What did you do? Oh no, what happened? Oh, did you do homework all weekend? Right? So there are lots and lots. Okay, I asked them if they sit and stared at the wall all weekend, then they usually tell you something that they did. That's a great idea, Angela. Okay, so no matter what their answer is, whether it's yes or no, come up with a question that you can ask them. Okay, so I want to say that sometimes, guys, follow-up questions are hard, and sometimes we get tired of asking questions because it feels like we're pulling teeth for our students, right? So how do we follow up with a content seeking question and teach our students and model that for our students? Well, what we have to think about are WH questions and not just yes, no questions. So a yes, no question requires a one-word response that is either yes or no. And you may have to ask a follow-up to get more questions. But when we ask a WH question, by the nature of the question, it requires more than yes or no. So you might say something like, who do you know that cooks Mexican food? Or when do you eat Mexican food? Or where do you eat Mexican food? Or why do you like Mexican food? Or how do you properly eat a taco? Do I eat that with a knife and fork? The answer is no. Okay. Or you can say, what's your favorite dish? But imagine this, if I say to my students in class, again, I have this imagination that says, if I say, oh, what's your favorite dish? That they're going to say, oh, I love tacos, especially carnitas tacos. They're spicy and delicious. How about you? But guess what? That's not reality either, right? In reality, when I say, what's your favorite Mexican dish? The answer is tacos, right? So I still get a one-word answer. It's not yes or no, but it's still a one-word answer. So the problem we have is that WH questions don't really necessarily build interaction either, because we still get one-word answers, and we want students to talk and interact much more than just with one-word answers. But actually, there's even a bigger problem, because sometimes if I say, what's your favorite Mexican dish? Crickets. I get nothing. There's no answer at all. And I'm saying, what's your favorite food? Sorry, food doesn't have to be Mexican dish. What's your favorite food? And I hear nothing. There is no answer. Okay. So why is that? What's the problem if I say to my students, what's your favorite food? Why don't they answer? Tell me, either unmute or tell me in the chat. What would be one reason why students might not answer this question? It can't be about me, because I'm friendly and welcoming, right? And they're not scared of me. Assume that anyway. Why don't they answer the question? Gretchen, this is a wonderful answer. Some non-American cultures are not focused on favorites and fun. What does it mean to have a favorite food? Food is what you do to give your body nutrition so that you can keep going, right? They don't know how to explain it in English, right? So I know what my favorite food is in English, but if I had to answer that in Spanish, I might not know how to say it in Spanish, right? It's hard to think of it in the moment, or it's hard to come up with a language. Good. And cultural food may be hard to explain the type to the group. That's a great answer, because if they give me a food that I don't know, then now that I'm going to ask them to tell me more about it, and they might not want to have to do that, right? Okay, Brenda, good answer. Favorite assumes just one answer, but maybe we have many foods that we really like. Okay. What do they not understand? Maybe they don't understand what the question is. Oh, they don't know if it's their turn to talk, right? In many cultures, classrooms are very much more rigid than they are in the US, and students only talk when they are called on to talk. In the American education system, that's not necessarily what happens, right? So here are some things that I thought about. Students don't know what the question means. Maybe they don't know this word favorite, and so they don't understand what it is that we're asking them. Another problem is that they just don't have a favorite food, right? Or they can't come up with it at that point in their brain. They're not thinking about food. They don't know how to say it in English. They're scared to talk. Okay. Or there are so many answers in their minds that they're overwhelmed with the possibilities, because, oh my gosh, I like tacos and I like enchiladas, but I also like lasagna, and I also like pizza, and I also really like shawarma, and I really like, there's all these things they like, and they can't pick one answer, right? So what do we do when our students don't answer our WH questions? How do we fix those questions to allow students more opportunities to talk? Well, let me introduce you to the art of the backup question, okay? So when we ask a question, like what's your favorite food, and we get nothing, ask a backup question, and that means a simpler question that narrows the field for our students. So I might say, well, if I say, hey, what's your favorite food, and nobody answers, then I might say, well, my favorite food is tacos. Do you like tacos? Now I've asked them a yes/no question. And so based on their answer, I follow up with a different question, right? So we ask a follow-up question. I might give them a 50-50 chance. I might say, well, which do you like better, tacos or enchiladas? And now they don't have to think about all the other foods in the world. They can just think about tacos or enchiladas. And again, they just have to choose one, right? So even if they don't understand the question, they probably can still respond to that, right? Now, what I might also do is say, what is this? And I might show them a food, right? Because if I'm asking what their favorite food is, chances are our lesson's going to be about food, right? So I might show them a food, make sure that it's something they know, or then provide them the vocabulary, and then ask them questions. Have you tried this food? Do you like this food? Right? So now I can totally change the question to be more specific about what it is I want to talk about. So if students don't answer, maybe you need to change the question you're answering. Maybe you need to change the question you're asking to make the question something that is more possible for them to answer. All right. So let's try this. You just asked students to tell you about their favorite book, and nobody says a word. Tell us in the chat, what's a backup question that you could ask? You don't want to throw it away. You still want them to be able to talk about books. What's a backup question you could ask that might get them to start answering your question and lead into a discussion about books? I'll give you a second to type. Oh, Michelle, great. What's the name of the last book you read? Oh, well, this is good. Are they reading yet? Well, you have to make sure they're reading, right? Do you read books at home? Tell me a book you have at home. If you're online, even better, you can say, go get a book, right? And they can bring it and they can actually show it to us. Do you go to the library? Is there a library close to you? Have you been there? Let's talk about how to get a library card and check books out. Any other backup questions you can think about? It's not always easy to think of a backup question. Have you read any books to your children? Great. You could even say, do you read in English or do you read in Spanish? Right? What kind of books do you like? Do you like adventure books? Do you like a drama? Do you like romance? What kind of books do you like? So ask a backup question. So just a review so far. So if you're asking yes, no questions, follow those up with a content seeking question so that your students will start to give more complete answers. And when students don't answer your questions, back up and make your question easier to answer. Narrow the field so that they can answer a specific question rather than considering all the possibilities in the world. Okay, so I have some other great backup questions in the chat. What was a book you remember from your childhood? Which of these book covers looks interesting to you? It might make them feel guilty, okay, if they're not reading. Okay, so yeah, definitely be careful. Make sure you know your students enough to know what you can and can't ask, right? So follow up, back up. And now I want to talk about tag questions. So we had a comment in the chat earlier about tag questions, and that second question, you don't like tacos, do you? Right? So that, how do we answer that, right? So what is a tag question? So let's just talk about tag questions for a second and why they're difficult. So a tag question is something like, you like pizza, don't you? Or you don't like pizza, do you? So grammatically, tag questions are a little bit weird. So if you have a positive statement like you like pizza, then you get a negative tag, don't you? So you like pizza, don't you? But if you have a negative statement, you get a positive tag. You don't like pizza, do you? So you have a mismatch in positive and negative in the statement and the tag that you add to it. So the problem with these is that, whoa, how do you answer these? So think about this. If I say to a student, you like pizza, don't you? And they say yes, I think we all know and understand that that means that they like pizza. If they say no, we're probably still relatively sure that they don't like pizza. But what if it's a negative statement? So you don't like pizza, do you? I'm taking a real survey here. I do not know the answer and I want to see what you guys think. If I say to a student, you don't like pizza, do you? And they say yes. Does that mean they like pizza or does that mean they don't like pizza? Tell me in the chat. They like pizza or they don't like pizza? If they say yes to you don't like pizza, do you? What do you think? Probably they do. Are you scared to answer because you're not sure either? I would not want to answer this question because I don't know. Honestly, I'm not. So we don't know, right? So no means yes, your statement's correct. Lori, you have the right answer. Just don't do that to your student. If we don't even know what that answer means, don't ask that question. It's confusing, even for a native speaker. I think students often think that when they say yes to a question like that, it means yes, but it's very, very confusing. Okay. So let me introduce you to the art of avoidance in question asking. First, I start by saying, just don't ask those negative tag questions. If we as native speakers of English don't know what the answer means, our students won't either, and it will be confusing to all of us. So just make it a policy in your class not to ask those questions. But it's not just tag questions that are confusing for students. So there's also abstract questions that we sometimes ask, and we have a purpose. We know what we mean by them, but we're really not asking the question that we want to. So what often happens, so maybe students were supposed to read something the night before, and we might say, and it's a natural thing, so hey, how did the reading go? What did you think of the reading? Well, what did you think of the reading is kind of like an opinion, like it was boring or it was stupid or it was incomprehensible or it was really good. But when we say, what did you think of the reading? That's not what we're asking. We're asking, did they read? We're asking, did they understand the reading? But that's not the question that is formed grammatically when we say, what did you think of the reading? So we ask this question that's even native speakers have trouble with this kinds of questions because it's very abstract. So instead of asking these kind of abstract, big picture questions, we need to break that down into specific and concrete questions that our students know the answers to, because it's unclear what the answer should be to what did you think of the reading? Because we don't care what they thought, we care whether they read. Right? So we need to ask content questions. So another thing we often do is we ask questions like, do you have any questions? Well, first, that's a yes, no question, right? The answer is yes or no. But students don't necessarily know if they have questions. So if you say, do you have any questions? Well, yes. Does that mean it's time to answer those questions? We don't know. Right? Because all you did was ask a yes, no question. So instead of asking, do you have any questions? Make it a practice to ask, what questions do you have? In other words, it's not a question of whether or not they have questions. It's time to invite them to ask those questions so that we can talk about them in class. So we say, what questions do you have? Or better yet, ask a question that tests their knowledge. Okay, so here's an example. You just taught a lesson about tag questions. So one thing that many teachers do is they say they teach the lesson about tag questions. And now we've explained the grammar of it. And then we say, do you have any questions? And nobody says anything. And we assume that that means that students don't have questions and we move on. But a better option is option B. Okay, great. Well, let's try it. What tag would go in this sentence? So, Bob, you like pizza. What's the tag that goes with you like pizza? And we know if they know the grammar based on whether or not they can do the tag. And then, Sarah, you don't like pizza. What's the tag that goes there? And so you actually have students practice doing what you just taught them to do. And when you do that, students have a chance to figure out what they do and don't understand. Because if all we did was teach them the grammar, but they didn't get a chance to practice it, I'm going to make this personal. When I study grammar in my second language and I'm learning the grammar rules, I go, okay, I know this rule, I know this rule, I know this rule. But when I have to actually apply those rules in speech, oh my gosh, it is so much harder. I have a hard time applying those rules. I need to figure out how to use those rules effectively in speech. I know the rules, but now I have to use them. So when we allow our students to try it out, they figure out what questions they have. Okay. So let's try it out. So I'll make it easy for you. I'm not going to make you do tag questions. You just explained the rules of past tense to your students. You've reviewed some common verbs with irregular past tense, so they know how to do some past tense stuff. So tell us in the chat, what is a question that you could ask that would test the students' knowledge of past tense so that you can all see whether or not they get past tense, rather than asking if they have any questions? What question could you ask to test their knowledge of past tense? In other words, that would make them use past tense in their answer. Okay, Sharon, how many miles did you run last week? Perfect. If they answer, they're going to have to say, I ran, and now they're going to use past tense in that answer. When did you leave work yesterday? Perfect. How did you come to school today? Can you tell me something you did over the weekend? So these questions are real life questions that they might get from other people, but they also use the language that you've just been trying to teach them. So, okay, what did you eat for breakfast? Okay, Sharon, you're right. They might answer, I didn't run any miles at all, but that's okay because they are still using past tense, right? So the idea is you get them using the past tense in real life questions. I tell my students all the time, my students that are training to become ESL teachers, I say, when you're asking questions, you give it the Walmart test. Could somebody walk up to them and actually ask this question in real life? Because I'll tell you, never once in my entire 50-something years has anybody come up to me in Walmart and said, oh my goodness, can you please tell me the past tense of this verb? Nobody does that. Nobody asks questions only about grammar, right? But they might ask us a question that forces us to use that knowledge in a real life answer. And that's what we want our students to have to think about, right? Nobody's going to ask them grammar rules, but everybody's going to ask them, what did you do on the weekend, or what did you do last night? All right. So my tips so far: follow up yes/no questions with content seeking questions, back up and prepare students for answering WH questions, avoid confusing and abstract questions like tag questions. And even though those are the 3 types of questions that I wanted to talk about today, that's actually not all of my tips. Okay, so let me introduce you to the art of shutting up. The biggest problem with building interaction, I'm making a big claim here. I'll be gentle. One of the biggest problems with building interaction in a classroom is that as teachers, we feel like we should be talking, and we forget to stop talking and give our students a chance to talk. So here's how this works. The art of shutting up. First, you ask a question. Any question that you want your students to answer. And then you wait and you count to 5 slowly. You don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Let me give you the answer. You say 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. And after you've done that, and only after you've done that, then you wait some more. Okay. And just keep counting and count to 5 again. Okay. Here's why. Students need time to process the question. So we've asked this question in their second language. and they have to figure out what that question means. As native speakers of a language, when somebody asks us a question, we simultaneously process that question and we know what the question is by the time they finish asking it. But we process much, much slower in a second language. So by the time we finish asking the question, students are still trying to figure out what we're asking. And so those first 5 seconds are for students to figure out what the question is. But in addition to figuring out what the question is, they have to figure out how to answer it. So those second 5 questions are to give them time to formulate an answer. Okay? Because again, in our first language, when somebody asks a question, we are processing simultaneously and we can immediately start talking because we can process and formulate the answer as we speak. But it's not that easy in a second language. So our students need time. They need time to figure out what the question is, and they need time to figure out what the answer is. Okay? So it takes so much longer in a second language than it does in a first language. You are going to feel, as the teacher, it's going to feel painful to you because you're going to be like, nobody's answering. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? But they will answer. They will. You're not really waiting as long as you think you are. But students will appreciate having the time to figure out how to answer your question. Now, I'm going to go back to Nikki's presentation on differentiation. The more advanced students get, the more quickly they can process questions. So if you're teaching beginners, you really have to make sure you're allowing them time to think. As they become more advanced, you might not have to wait quite as long for them, okay? But especially if you're teaching beginner and intermediate students, you must give them time, okay? So my tip is stop talking. Give students a chance to answer, okay? I'm gonna add something to that. It's not just that you're not waiting long enough when we ask questions. It's that sometimes we forget to stop and ask questions and we just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. So I'm giving a presentation here and I have an hour. So I can talk for the whole hour because that's actually what I'm supposed to be doing, right? I'm hoping you're getting a chance to interact, but this is a presentation. But a presentation is not really how classrooms, particularly ESL classrooms, should work. There should be dialogue and there should be interaction. And you should make a conscious effort to include multiple chances for students to talk throughout your class. So if I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation, my goal is usually that I have at least one question on every other slide that students are going to have a chance to pause and talk about and answer so that they have a chance to talk, okay? So that I don't do all of the talking in an ESL class because I already know how to speak English. I want my students to have a chance to talk and to practice their English. So one more thing, and Angela's presentation was about this this morning. She gave us some great tips about knowing our students, but I'm just going to add to that when we're asking questions, we still have to know our students. So imagine that you're in a class and somebody says, explain the current political situation in Guatemala. And you're supposed to answer this in your second language. So think about this in your second language. I'm a pretty advanced Spanish speaker, and I don't know how to talk about politics in Spanish. That's not something I do. I do not have political vocabulary in Spanish. So even though I have lived in Guatemala and I can go and travel and have all my needs met and get everything done that I need to do, I can't do this question because I don't have the language that's necessary to talk about this. I don't know how to talk about politics in Spanish because I've never done that before. So when you ask your questions, you have to know your students well enough to know if they have the language needed in order to respond to the question or maybe even to understand the question. you have to think about the vocabulary. Do they have the vocabulary they need to answer this? You have to ask, especially for lower level students, are they really ready to talk about abstract things? Can they answer those why and how questions? Or do we need something more concrete and specific for them to answer? But we also have to think about interest. Guys, it's not just that I don't have the language to talk about politics. It's that I'm not interested in politics. That's why I don't have the language, because that's not a conversation that I enter into even in English. So I don't know what to say, because I don't know what the current political situation is, or because I'm just not interested in talking about that. I'd rather talk about food, right? So if you know your students and you know their interests, then when you ask a question and nobody answers, you should say, did I ask a question that is good for this class of students? Or did I ask a question that maybe they don't care about? So you have to think about their interest. You have to think about whether or not the students want to talk about that, and whether or not they have the language necessary for it. So by knowing our students, we are better able to choose questions that our students that they're able to answer, but also that they will answer because they want to engage. They want to talk about the topic that we chose for them. So in review, here are Dr. K's tips for building interaction. Follow up when you need to, especially when you ask yes/no questions. Back up when you need to, especially when you ask WH questions. Avoid when you need to, especially tag questions. Just stop talking and give the students a chance to answer. And finally, always know your students. And if you follow those things, I think you will see interaction and engagement building in your classroom and your students talking more. Now, I'm going to stop talking now and give you a chance. What questions do you have? You may unmute and speak. I invite you to do that, or you can put questions in the chat and I'm happy to answer them there as well. And I'm going to unshare so that I can see you again. Any questions? So I am happy to share the PowerPoint. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if you email me, I am happy to send you a copy of the PowerPoint. I did not get techie and put a QR code. I usually have my presentations on, I usually put my presentations on Google Docs, and I completely forgot this time. So feel free to email me if you'd like a copy.
May I ask a question about Ram and Ryan? Okay, so it just hit me that, so I would have looked for them to say, Ryan as the past tense. Did you run in class? The question I might have asked was, which would have been a yes/no question, did you run in PE class? And then I would ask, how many miles did you run? And they would say, I ran 5 miles. But we didn't say, I didn't run any. We say, I didn't run any today. Mm-hmm. So that's really confusing of when to use run and no run.
Yeah, so that is such a great point. So when we think about that negation, so we still have a past tense in that sentence. Mm-hmm. We didn't, right? So we put our past on the auxiliary of did instead of putting our past tense on the main verb. But we do that. That's always what we do in English. When we have an auxiliary, we have a bare verb. We don't make the verb past tense. So Yeah, students will have to learn that before they're ready to do those negation things.
And that's hard. Yeah.
Hard. It is absolutely hard.
And so on your tag questions, you know, when we've got, the first time I answered it, I don't remember, but anyway, I would have changed it when I qualified it. When you say, you don't like pizza, and I would, do you? And I would say, no, I don't. And so I qualified it. But if I didn't, I had written yes. You know? So, yeah.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. So if we often, when we answer tag questions, we answer with yes, I did, or no, I didn't, right? That clarifies that answer, right? So you don't like pizza, do you? Yes, I do. We know that means, yes, I do like pizza. But if our students don't know to include I do and I don't as then it's confusing. So if you're going to ask tag questions, it's really important that we make sure that we have taught them how to answer tag.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely. I see a question in the chat as well. Sharon, sorry for the complicated. I'm not sure which complicated example you're talking about, Sharon. Oh, what did you eat was a better example. It doesn't elicit the negative before they're ready for it. Okay, you're right. I think that you're talking about the run example, right?
I was going to share something, if I may. Just that on asking the more, getting students to talk, I find that if I, first of all, you know, we've already done some scaffolding as far as the vocabulary or the topic. And then if I model it with the students, with a student maybe, and then I put them in their own pairs or small groups, sometimes they're more willing to try something with each other than they are with the whole group or with me, because it's, you know, not as scary. So I don't know. And if I put them in small groups, I'm taking myself out of the equation. So I'm not tempted to dominate the conversation, which we are all apt to do as teachers.
Yes, I love that idea. One of the things I'll often have students, if I ask a question and I know it's going to be a hard one, I'll say, talk about this with your partner, you know, talk about this with the person seated next to you. And here's the thing, you know, when students, sometimes they don't want to talk because they're not sure if their answer is right, and they don't want to be embarrassed in front of the class. And as teachers, we want to help our students save face, right? We don't want them to embarrass themselves. So if we say, well, talk about it with a partner, then if their answer is wrong, their partner will correct it. But if their partner's like, oh yeah, you're right, I think that's the answer, then now there's power in numbers. They're not the only person who's going to be wrong. Somebody else agrees with them. So I love pairing students up. And, you know, guys, to do paired activities, it doesn't have to be 25 or 30 or 40 minutes. It can be 2 minutes, right? Have them talk to the person next to them and then share out with the class, but they will be more comfortable sharing because they've had a chance to talk it through and practice it. And as Jennifer mentioned, it gives them more practice, right? So the teacher is doing less talking and the students are doing more talking. And Angela points out in that situation that the partner might give them the language they need to answer the question. Maybe they don't know a vocabulary word, but their partner does. So they share knowledge, and that helps. Jennifer, absolutely. On Zoom, you can use breakout rooms. You can drop people into breakout rooms for 2 minutes and then call them back, right? But it gives them a chance to talk. It gives them a chance to interact and engage with each other and use their language. And that's what we want them to be doing, is using their language.